So our next panel is on the rather critical question of who needs deterring. So we opened or tiptoed a little into some of that in the last panel, but I think now they're going to give it a really thorough examination. So I'd like you to welcome Shashank Joshi and our second panel for this morning.
Yes, please. Anywhere's fine. Any particular? You're welcome anywhere, I think.
Okay.
Wonderful. Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for joining us for this second panel. We've had a fantastic, really mind-stretching initial panel on deterrence. Our panel today, formally on the programme, is tasked, I think, with the title, Who Needs Deterring? But I think we can dispatch that answer in about 10 seconds. And so I suggest we expand the mandate of this panel to who needs deterring, what needs deterring, and how do we deter it? And that may be too ambitious for the 55 minutes we have allocated, but I hope we get through some of it. I won't introduce everyone because you know who they are. They're a very illustrious panel. They're ideally suited for this topic. But I hope we will get on to that topic that has been a running theme from the Secretary of State's talk this morning on intelligence about Chinese lethal aid to Russia, and the panel previously on whether we are facing an axis of powers or something less than that. And I think our discussions, I hope, will come back to that question and the role of deterrence in addressing it. I think the place to begin, though, is with Benedetta to my right, who, of course, is with NATO on Russia. And I think the place to begin here, Benedetta, is the question of, is deterrence holding? Is it stable, or is it eroding? And I don't think this is an easy question to answer. The Secretary of State this morning has previously said we are in a pre-war phase, which on the face of it suggests deterrence is eroding, and potentially dangerously and rapidly so. Others, including the Chief of Defence Staff, have said despite all the efforts NATO needs to make in living up to its plans, Russia is deterred, and it understands it would lose, and as CDS has said, lose quickly. So to start with, Benedetta, which is it? Is deterrence stable, or is it eroding?
That's an easy, thank you. That's a really easy question to answer in 3 minutes, but I'll give it a shot. Well, first of all, deterrence is never stable. I think we have to think about it as a dynamic concept, and you need to manage deterrence constantly, and that's exactly what we do at NATO through our deterrence and defense posture. You can never rest assured that deterrence is holding. You always have to look at all your instruments of power and see how you use them in a way that continuously signals to your adversaries and competitors that you have the capability, resolve, and will to respond if they were to cross the threshold. So that's the in terms of saying it's never a done deal. Yeah. Deterrence is always something you need to manage. But in terms of is it eroding, is it holding, I would say we need to maybe parse that question a little bit. When it comes to Article 5, so when it comes to really crossing the threshold of armed attack, we believe, and I think Putin's behavior shows that there is a degree of deterrence, and that he does understand the consequences of crossing into Allied territory. But I think we need to take a step back and recognize how big of a shift it was, and it is, for us as 32 allies to rebuild that ability to credibly deter and defend. That process really started for NATO in 2014 with the illegal annexation of Crimea. He sent our military planners back to the drawing board and said, for the first time in decades, we actually have to consider the problem of territorial defense of Europe seriously. And that's a generational shift that we're still implementing. And through the morning, you heard it's about more capabilities, it's about more cash, it's about stronger force posture. But at the bottom of it all, it is how do you rebuild a credible instrument of power as the backbone of any types of deterrence? And I think that's a really important lesson, because before we move to the gray zone, I think we, in the past, overestimated how much strategic competition and adversarial dynamics would be below the threshold. And I think over the next over the past 10 years, starting with Crimea, but you can also see Russia in Syria, you can also see Iran in Syria, et cetera, there's been a lowering of the threshold for the use of armed force. And I think that we need to keep in mind, because as I move to part 2 of the answer, which is the gray zone, I think nothing that we do in the gray zone, so nothing of the soft power can happen if we don't have a credible and much stronger military instrument of power that we need to rebuild. And I think that's an important lesson to start our conversation. That said, military power is necessary, is the backbone of any credible deterrence. And I think we see that when we see that we're perceived as weaker, our adversaries become more brazen and test us more and more towards the threshold of armed conflict. But very briefly, a lot of the areas where we are challenged today and where we need to think about how do we boost our deterrence are actually below the threshold of armed conflict. In the cyberspace, when it comes to our critical infrastructure, but also when it comes to the resilience of our democratic institutions and societies, because we do see our adversaries are trying to essentially weaken us and neuter us from within, if you want to use that expression. And there, the recipe, I think, is doing more when it comes to deterrence by denial, so that's resilience, and we can talk more about what exactly that entails, but it is strengthening ourselves, making it harder for Russia, because we went back to Russia, to continue with its act of sabotage, violence, cyber operations, foreign interference, because it's something that we see on the rise. But I also think we need to do forward resilience, which means we also need to work more with our partners to build their resilience against malign interference, which, if you wish, is a form of containment. So I think those are some of the pillars of how we think about resilience through deterrence, both above and below the threshold. And of course, we also need to be credible when it comes to deterrence by punishment in the gray zone, and that's always a convoluted conversation that maybe we'll return to in terms of attribution, in terms of what type of responses we can deploy. But I think if we need to have all these elements.
Thank you, Benedetta. And what I take, the bit I pull out particularly is your point that the threshold for the use of force has fallen, which regardless of whether deterrence is eroding or stable or growing, it's harder. I think that's one point I take away, and maybe we can elaborate on that. Jade, can I turn to you, please, and just dive a little bit more into Russia. Who needs deterring? Well, this is a personalist regime in some respects, so there's a sort of real psychological element to this. Deterrence is a psychological relationship with an adversary, and I'd just like to ask you, do we understand what Putin fears, what he worries about, what deters him, and has our understanding of that changed, and does Russia think about it in a way that is perhaps different to the way that our leaders would think about it?
Very good questions, quite a lot to unpack. So in the UK, we tend to think about deterrence as preventing generally military action by threatening certain consequences. And of course, as Benedetta's just been explaining, that needs to be credible. It needs to be credible in all of these different ways. But another way, especially if we're thinking about this from a Russian perspective, that it needs to be credible is politically. It needs to be clear that the things we're saying are politically viable. And that's especially important for Russia. Why? Because Russia's understanding of deterrence is much more integrated. It spans wartime, peacetime, and their entire view of security is very much focused on this societal and cultural element. To give just a very quick example, if we go to the National Security Strategy, there are 40 references to culture. In the UK's integrated review refresh, you have one reference to culture, which is about HR practices, and another reference to culture, which is about kind of selling more Paddington bears, something like this. So very different conceptual.
Vital tool to stake.
Vital tool. Paddington will deter everything. It will be fine. He'll save us all. No, I mean no criticism of Paddington. I'm a big fan, but it's just, there's a time and a place. And I think that this feeds in this sense that Western societies are weak, that Western societies are on their way out, that this war is part of ushering in a new era of multipolarity, that actually, of course, does have many similarities, with the way that it's presented by China, but it's also quite different. I mean, Russia is a much more revisionist power than China is, I think, in many ways, though I'll leave that to the China experts to go into depth on. But if we want to provide, a a credible form of deterrence, I think that this societal aspect is lacking. And what's needed for it? Well, first of all, I would say we need to prepare our societies, and I would do that first of all by officially banning the phrase, we are with Ukraine as long as it takes, because this just means nothing. What, as long as it takes for them all to die? I mean, before I came on, I called one of my closest friends, who also happens to be a soldier fighting in the Kharkiv region. And I asked him, okay, I'm about to talk at this conference. It's sort of a big deal. You know, what would you say if you were there? You know, what do you need? And he said, well, we need drones. We need 125 millimeter, I believe, artillery. He's obviously better at the military stuff than I am. And we need fighter jets, and we need air defense in order to get them out, in order to get them back out of Kharkiv. And that's the constant point. I mean, their morale has not wavered. And so I find it slightly odd when you hear about Ukraine fatigue here in the West, which is essentially just a very polite way of saying we don't have any resilience, you know, to stay in this fight, even though it's not on us. That, well, I'm going back to Kharkiv tonight, so it could be on me, but it's not generally on us in this audience that 500-kilogram glide bombs are landing. So we should perhaps be able to dig a bit deeper and find a bit more resilience. I don't want to criticize society alone, though, because I think that essentially there are a few issues, one of which is some of the strategic communications around the war, some of which are about the fact that we don't talk. I think particularly to Britain, there's a sort of complacency that it will all just be fine, because broadly things have kind of just been fine, probably for most of my life in terms of foreign policy, but, you know, for us as Britons. But that's no longer the case. And secondly, I think we need to be much more concrete about what is at stake. So it's fine to talk about freedom and that's important, but ultimately they're quite abstract concepts to most Britons. In Ukraine, no, freedom is, you know, the ability to not be kicked out of your house and then a collaborator is rehoused there, or not to be taken off to a basement and tortured for absolutely no reason. Here, they're abstract. What do we do to make them concrete before we have to learn that they're concrete? That's a really difficult task. I won't pretend to have the answer. But I think that we can talk about some of the tangible outcomes. For example, if Russia were to have some form of victory in Ukraine, whether or not that's imposing a very unfavorable to Ukraine negotiated settlement, or, you know, a full-on kind of they get to Kyiv, the costs to British people would be enormous. We're talking around over 40% increase in energy prices. We're talking about the poorest 10% of households spending 25% of their entire income on energy. We're talking about food price inflation of between about 30 to 50%. We're of course talking about massively increased defense spending. So there's also, I think that needs to come into play. And that's without even talking about the fact that we can see what's happening in the occupied territories. A lot of my research focuses on the occupied territories of Ukraine. These towns and cities that have been destroyed, they're not being rebuilt. Popasna is not being rebuilt. They're being turned into military bases. They're being turned into militarized bases. So the more land that Russia has in Ukraine, the more there will be militarized bases, and then they'll get closer and closer to the border with NATO countries. And then that, of course, brings us back to the original point. We're going to consistently see, the more successful Russia is in Ukraine, we're going to consistently see this prodding at Article 5. We see it already today, you know, with the Russian unilateral decision to move the borders, move its state borders within the Baltic Sea with Finland and Lithuania. This is a constant asking, how serious are you about Article 5? And I don't know how many people in this audience really want to answer that question when it comes, you know, to who is going to fight for Narva or Daugava pills. And that's a discussion, and not a happy one, that they're having in the Baltic states that I just came back from.
Can I pause you there?
Yes,
and then we'll build on that. I think that's a really, really useful set of remarks. And I think your contention there is that Ukraine and Western policy in Ukraine is inextricably tied to our deterrence against Russia more broadly, writ large, and the credibility of Article 5 writ large.
Yes.
And if anyone disagrees on the panel, then I'd also like to hear that contending view, but that's a really helpful place to take us. I then want to take us back to a point that Benedetta raised on the grey zone, sub-threshold, and you touched on a little bit. And Henrik, I want to come to you, which is the idea of the Russian challenge below Article 5. Of course, we, in the last few months, have charged people for arson in the United Kingdom acting on behalf of the Wagner Group. We've seen allegations of GRU activity across Europe. What I want to ask, however, is whether we're doing enough on this. There are a number of cases that European officials are worried about and are concerned about, but they have not publicly attributed to Russia. So what I want to ask you is, are we afraid of attributing things to Russia, in your view? And to the extent that we are seeing what, Benedetta, your colleagues at NATO have described as an intensifying campaign of hybrid activity, including arson, sabotage, cyber activity in critical national infrastructure, information warfare, do we have the policy levers to address this?
Good question, and we are not used to it. First of all, I think it's important to say that even if we would not define this as war, given that our definitions of international law, etc., for Russia it definitely is. And they are testing us every day, 24/7, all over the scale, all 32 countries of NATO. So we may not believe that it's war, but for them it is definitely war. I would say that there is still a lot to do regarding practices on escalation, on attribution, on debunking, pre-bunking, regarding disinformation, etc. But we are getting better. I think what the caution is not a fear of escalation or to reveal our vulnerabilities. The caution is to stand united and to use the EU and NATO systems to show Russia that we actually is ready to act, ready to attribute, ready to act, and ready to react. When it comes to reaction, of course our systems are far from perfect, but there are many good examples. I mean, we all know that Russians have immense cyber attack capabilities. Sometimes they are even using them. But when President Biden tells the Russians, don't mess with our critical infrastructure, don't mess with our escalation, because that will lead to a massive counterattack, that will leave Russia pretty unsafe in cyber terms. It works. So we need to increase, of course, our technical defenses in that regard, but also make very clear that we have the ability, which we do have.
So more deterrence by punishment.
To actually counter. We don't want to move. I mean, my country is a peaceful country. We stayed out of alliances for 212 years. We became members of NATO as a part of NATO deterrence. And I would say that the membership of Sweden and Finland in NATO reinvigorates also Article 5, because Sweden and Finland are countries that do not, for a millimeter, doubt that this defense starts in Narva, this defense starts in Daugavpils. And we are willing to put, our stakes are definitely there. And we went into this alliance for these reasons. Regarding how vulnerable we are, I mean, there are no, if our societies do not have vulnerabilities, there is no viable threat. That should also be remembered. And of the 32 NATO countries, there's the resilience is so varied. It's so different from country to country. And many countries still have a lot of homework to do. Sweden, even probably being among sort of the best in class, still has vulnerabilities that we wouldn't like to reveal. We are working on them. We are working on them in civil defense, in total defense, in the creation of new agencies like the Agency for Psychological Defense that I led during 2022. Etc. So we are on our way. We are not yet there, but we are not afraid of attributing. We are not. I wouldn't argue that our system as a whole is afraid of countering Russia in that regard. We are in the process of calibrating our responses and building the broader capacities needed to actually counter. But having said that, of course we must be able to punish, but deterrence is also not only about denial, but it is to have credible force not having to punish, because the adversary should never even think about acting. I mean, that's the essence of deterrence. The best bullets never leaves the weapon. The use of the force is something completely different to the use of violence.
And just before I move on to Rory in just 1 second, can I add one other follow-up briefly, Henrik, which is there is an asymmetry to this competition in that Russia can blow up ammunition depots in Europe. We don't blow up ammunition depots in Russia. But are there areas where the West and allies ought to be less squeamish about retaliation in kind or deterrence by punishment in ways that you think we are not at present?
And that's one of the areas where we still haven't calibrated reasonable response. I mean, proportionality, that's the basic understanding in how we handle threats so far. We may move in a direction where we become slightly more unpredictable and asymmetric too, because our enemy is unpredictable and asymmetric. And if we sort of stick to full proportionality and predictability at all times, that may be a disadvantage.
I think that's a really interesting thought, and an excellent way to segue to you, Rory. We heard a lot about China this morning, both in terms of the threat in Ukraine, but also more broadly, both at the conventional level and at the sub-threshold level. And in recent months, we've seen so many obvious manifestations of that, most starkly in the form of water cannoning of Philippines vessels. So I just wonder if you could give us a sense of, in a way, the same question I put to Benedetta, right? Is deterrence stable or eroding in the Indo-Pacific? And perhaps to zoom in a little bit more, has our understanding of the threat posed by China at these different levels evolved in the last 6 to 12 months, do you think, or is it broadly stable?
So much to cover. Look, thank you. I think, firstly, it's great that we're looking across the theatres. We're not looking at Europe or the Indo-Pacific or, I guess, even the Middle East in isolation in any of this. We can come back to that. From an Australian perspective now, deterrence is front and centre of the defence conversation, so that's a good development. And I think that also frames, for example, well, importantly, the logic of AUKUS, which we might get onto at some point. China is obviously centre of the frame when we're thinking about the challenge to strategic equilibrium, to peace and stability in the Indo-Pacific. Some of our governments are careful in the way we articulate that, but it's very clearly about China. We need to be, I think, careful when we think, well, the wolf warrior diplomacy of a couple of years ago is a little bit more constrained now. I mean, for example, in Australia's case, we talk about stabilisation of relations with China, but these are very, very limited goals. And I think when it comes to the realities in the water and on the ground and in the air, deterrence is not necessarily eroding, but it's certainly not stable. The behaviour of Chinese forces towards Taiwan, towards the Philippines, to some degree as well towards others like Japan, Australia, in the region has persistently grown over the past few years, and increasingly China's using risk as kind of an instrument of policy, essentially daring other countries to respond or to back down under that threshold of war. I think you've used the example of the South China Sea, Second Thomas Shoal, the constant and potentially lethal harassment of Philippines resupply and fishing fleets and so forth by Chinese Coast Guard with the PLA Navy in the background at all times. So I think it is really important we don't take our eye off the China challenge. I think the China-Russia relationship almost does the work for us in justifying why we need to think about this as one global theatre. And if we're hearing words about, if you like, indirect aid actually translating to lethal aid for Russia and Ukraine, that just sharpens that argument. I would just add one point to get the conversation going, and that is to say that I think the question for this session is, who are we deterring? I think the we is just as important as the what are we deterring and the who. Because this isn't only a task for the United States or Britain or Europe or, I guess, the West as traditionally perceived. In the Indo-Pacific, you've got Australia, you've got Japan, you've got Philippines, you've got, to some degree now, South Korea, you've got India playing its own complex role, but there's potentially very large coalitions to balance against that Chinese coercion and assertiveness. What we don't yet have is that architecture of deterrence that helps us work at all those levels, from the grey zone coercion right through to the very real threat of the use of force.
can I ask you just a quick follow-up on this, which is to say, there's no doubt the Sino-Russian axis is deepening, strengthening. We heard some examples of that this morning. But there's two ways to respond to that. One is to say, as you did, this is a global theatre. You integrate your deterrence across these two fronts. That's a very daunting prospect if you're in Europe, where your military assets are already insufficient to fully, credibly meet all of the plans that your colleagues at NATO have laid out and are developing. The other is to say, there must be some way to drive a split between these big powers. The temptation of the wedge, the split, is always there, right? To say we can peel China away, or if you're sitting in Asia, if you're in India, we can peel Russia away from China. Why are you driving Russia into China's arms? So what sort of counsel do you offer Europeans who are paralyzed by that sense of how on earth do you expect us to do this when we're already not sure if we can deter Russia?
Look, I think there is a third answer to that question, which is not. Those of us in the Indo-Pacific expect to see some, extraordinary European frontline presence in the region, or those of you in Europe expect to see countries like Australia and Japan taking a lead role. I think we do have to differentiate what we bring to these coalitions, and it's important also to understand that deterrence at that global level is not only going to work at a military level, at a conventional level. There's an economic dimension. There's that dimension which I think we heard in the previous panel of the calculations that the Chinese should make, which is that it would be economically catastrophic for them to launch aggressive action to annex Taiwan by force. The more that we can build solidarity in getting that message back to China that the economic costs, let alone all of the other costs, are simply not worth it, that's where I think we need to start building a sense of global solidarity. But there are also other areas. I think cyber security, logistics and supply chains. It's still very difficult to imagine that NATO would sit idle if the United States and its allies in the Indo-Pacific found themselves in military confrontation. So I think we have to start with those realistic expectations, but then push those expectations right to their limit, and that does involve conversations with our public. So I really like the point that I think Jade made earlier about the social dimension of this, because we do have countries still where societies are simply not prepared for the prospect of confrontation or conflict.
Benedetta, can I come back to you on this question of adversary alignment, the alignment between these powers? Mm-hmm. I think Neil Ferguson in the last session talked about Philip Zeliko's recent essay where he said the Axis powers of today are engaging in more defence industrial collaboration than those of the 1930s in many respects. And this came up, of course, in the NATO strategic concept, which is now nearly 2 years old. So this has been on your radar for a while. You've seen it coming. How has your understanding of it changed? Do you have a better handle on the problem of what, as an alliance, you can do about it, rather than just admiring the problem and meeting on a panel and us saying, isn't it terrible that they're all collaborating and building up their defence industries?
So the answer is yes, of course. We don't just admire the problem, but if I can start with 2022 and the strategic concept, I think that already acknowledged that growing strategic convergence between Russia and China, building in, of course, also the North Korean and Iranian element. But I think fast forward to 2024, we might have underestimated the pace of that collaboration. And I think that also indirectly answers your question about driving a wedge. There's been a path dependency here, and the level of support, I think, that the People's Republic of China has provided to Russia to enable its war machine in Ukraine, essentially, I think has solidified that relationship to a point where we may intellectually have this interesting conversation, whether we call it an alliance, how much transactional it is. That's really an intellectually stimulating conversation, but in practice, the People's Republic of China's level of support in Russia makes it a player on the European security in a way that it hadn't been even a year ago. So there is a cumulative effect, right? And if only a year ago I would have said, North Korea's ammunition are going to have a substantial effect in Europe, we would have probably said that's unthinkable, and that's really the reality we're in today. And of course, North Korea is also getting something in return, and the same is true for Iran. So that's what we need to, I think, face. And rather that, of course, if we can find areas of disagreement, we should push and probe and test them. But I think our main strategy is that of how do we build credible response. And part of it, Rory already addressed, it is about that trans-theater solidarity, if you wish, right? And I think Ukraine offers us a model. Australia, Japan, the Republic of Korea, New Zealand, they're not putting boots on the ground in Ukraine, but they are upholding sanctions. They are politically supporting what we're doing as a transatlantic alliance. They are providing support to Ukraine. And you could use that as a template to articulate the interlinkages between the theaters. And I would say, just like Australia's, I think, by and large, understand that a strategic failure of deterrence in Europe would make deterrence in the Indo-Pacific much worse. I think conversely, in Brussels, Paris, London, or Berlin, we should internalize the fact that the opposite is also true. So we also have a vested interest in the stability of the Indo-Pacific and in upholding deterrence, which is why I also hope we talk about AUKUS and arrangements that are really building in that direction. So there are things we are doing, both through NATO and allies bilaterally or multilaterally. And again, it is about bringing all the effects to bear in an integrated deterrence framework, where you're not going to expect European naval assets to make a military difference in a potential confrontation in an Indo-Pacific scenario, with some very limited exceptions. But you are going to expect, I think, that we leverage our instruments of economic statescraft to impose cost on, let's say, the PRC, if it were to engage in escalatory and aggressive behavior in a way that would change its calculations.
So let me take that up, actually, and turn to you, Henrik, which is to ask that we have lots of examples of Indo-Pacific partners providing support in the European theatre, South Korea and shells for Ukraine being a great example. And there are some examples in the other direction. In AUKUS is a kind of one example that cuts across. But from your perspective, are we doing enough in that direction? Are we doing enough to uphold those responsibilities Benedetta talked about to shore up deterrence in the Indo-Pacific? And are there examples you might give us of areas where you're thinking or pondering what more might be done?
In that regard, we are probably not, we are doing enough in military terms because we have our plates full in Ukraine. If you look at all those European countries supporting Ukraine, I mean, we are deep down into our inventories already now. And the limited capabilities as a result of a, well, sort of more or less 20-year peace dividend has shown its limits. So, I mean, there is not much that we can actually provide in practical terms, even if we / some countries would like to do that. But what we can do is to show our full solidarity and our understanding of the sort of the immediate communication between the fight in Ukraine and how that ends, and how that will play out in the Indo-Pacific. So full support politically, diplomatically, but also a sort of step-by-step convergence of US and European approaches toward China. They will never be identical. We have different interests, but if we can at least be on the same page, sing from the same sort of page, so to speak, in our dealings with China, which is a systemic threat not only to the US, but also to our way of living. And that's, I mean, that's my basic assumption here. Doesn't necessarily mean that we have to or should go all in now. But the existential thing with this long term is, of course, that China needs Russia as a partner in its challenge to the rules-based, liberal, Western order that we have created over the last 30 years. It is in their interest to create a multilateral order where their interests, where might is more than, where might plays a bigger role than right, and where sort of future structures and regulations are more aligned with their interests, but with ours, and what we perceive to be universal democratic interests of not only the Western world but globally. And if we don't have sort of that geopolitical struggle and clear tendencies, I mean that's obvious after the last 10 years, we may make this too much of a sort of transactional power play on a lower level in the value chain, so to speak.
Okay, and I think that gets to some interesting divisions within Europe that we probably haven't got time to excavate here, but I'm certainly thinking of a German view that remains quite mercantilist, very unwilling to move too far in the direction of what they might see as decoupling, a French view that was articulated in an interview with us, my colleagues at The Economist a few months ago, where there is still the sense France is being squeezed by two big trade blocs from either side, and actually therefore must preserve some sort of independence. But Jade, I'm going to open up to the floor in just a minute, but I want to turn to you and just ask about the flip side, the Russian role in the Indo-Pacific and how they influence events and developments in that theatre. How does the Russian partnership with China, do you think, influence? I guess what I want to get at is how far is Russia willing to go? Is this just a sort of defense industrial partnership, an ideological partnership, or do we need to think about, for example, Russian diversionary moves in the event of a conflict in Asia that would have significant implications for NATO allies and for the United States? And a lot of that comes down to how Russia sees the problem, and you are an expert on Russia.
I think it's an interesting question in terms of how Russia understands its role in that region. But also, I mean, Russia is clearly the weaker partner. It's much more dependent. There are a number as well of Russian elites, a good chunk, who are not very happy with not necessarily with the closeness with the closeness with China. And of course, like all post-imperial, Russia isn't post-imperial yet, but with all of those sort of countries, it's very difficult for many Russians to come to terms with their little brother role. In general, the Chinese are very delicate about it, without sort of rubbing the Russians' faces in it. However, I mean, I just feel like there's things that could be done to perhaps exacerbate those tensions. So, look, it's an alliance. As far as I understand it, this is an alliance of interest. It creates a lot of tension. There are still a lot of fears within Russian society, among certain parts of Russian elites, of the idea of the Chinese are coming for Siberia. Although I don't subscribe to, I suppose, the sort of the Kissinger or the reverse Kissinger in terms of splitting them up, I do think that more could be done to exacerbate tensions between the two countries, because it's an alliance of interests. It's not an alliance of deep and mutual admiration and love.
Great. Okay, Rory, anything you want to add to that before I go to the floor in a second?
Well, sort of a view from the Indo-Pacific. I think that although I think any sort of right-thinking people are horrified by Russia's behaviour in Ukraine, in the Indo-Pacific, Russia has been a more mixed actor. I mean, so for example, it's kind of nice to know that Vietnam, Indonesia, the Philippines, and even India in that regard have Russian kit that they might potentially use to deter China in their own face-offs. So I think we tend to see Russia more as a spoiler in the Indo-Pacific rather than as a decisive actor. That doesn't mean that we don't take it very, very seriously.
Okay, thank you. Can I start with the lady over there, please, and I'll then go to the lady on the other side as well. And I'll take three at a time, please. Go ahead.
Thank you so much for this.
If you could introduce yourself, please, as well, that'd be very helpful for us.
My name is Marina Henke. I am a professor at the Hertie School in Berlin. And I would like to shift the discussion to space. The news are reporting that the Russians have launched a satellite that could turn into a weapon. We have heard also of a potential nuclear weapon in space by the Russians. We are all here in the UK, in Europe, in the Western world, very heavily dependent on space. So what's your opinion on how can we deter Russian but also potential Chinese actions in space? Do we need send our own weapons up there to space, or can we deter these space weapons from Earth?
Thank you. Over there.
Thank you. My name's Guinevere. I work at the Foreign Office. There's been a lot of talk about deterrence, but I'm quite interested.
Can everyone hear? Sorry, I think that mic might not be working.
Should I shout? Okay, there we go.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Guinevere. I work at the Foreign Office. There's been a lot of talk about deterrence, but I'm quite interested in the sort of counterpart of arms control. Could the panel give their views on sort of the current state of arms control? Do you see it playing a bigger or smaller role in the next few years? Thank you.
And there was one more behind. Yes, over there, please.
Callum Fraser, IISS. My question is for Henry. So you talk very poignantly about the fact that Western politicians are often reticent to act disproportionately and unpredictably. Given all the talk we've had about being on a pre-war footing, what more is it going to have to take for Western politicians to move and take those kind of decisive and bold actions to act in a way which is more robust and truly deter further Russian aggression? Thank you.
Okay, thank you all for those. Let's start with Benedetta, with you. We're among friends. Spill all the NATO intelligence on Russian space capabilities. Tell us what's happening.
Sure. Or not. But I shall...
Totally secure room.
Of course, there's no cameras. No, but I think the question is very important because it reflects the very real concern about the increased militarization, if you wish, of space, which is something we had very strongly tried to avoid in terms of messaging, in terms of trying to build. And it also ties to the question on arms control, because in an ideal world, that would be obviously something we would very much wish. I'll return to the fact that unfortunately we're not in an ideal world right now. So yes, Russian behavior in space has been cause of concern. There's been a number of incidents that were just mentioned in terms of reckless behavior. That is something that obviously undermines stability more broadly and forces us to have an in-depth reflection about the strength of our deterrence and defense across all domains. For NATO, space is an operational domain, so it means we need to be able to deter and defend credibly also against attacks from within and in space. So that means some in-depth reflection on policies, on capabilities, and there's also, of course, an easier element to discuss in public, which is, of course, the resilience of our civilian-owned satellites and space infrastructure upon which our militaries depend. And that is one of the key, I would say, if I had to point out 2 or 3 sectors, civilian sectors that are key enablers of our deterrence and defense posture today, I would definitely say space, transport, energy, and digital communication. And all of this is mostly civilian-owned. Mm-hmm. And mostly we need to really increase our ability to work with the private sector and with civilian counterparts to step up our ability to strengthen our resilience against attacks, sabotage in those domains. Arms control, maybe very, very quickly.
Sure.
I mean, we in NATO, and I think that remains a valid point, effective, reciprocal, based on trust and verification, arms control contributes to deterrence. And that's why it is in our interest. But of course there are caveats. Reciprocity is important. Some level of verification is important. Some level of trust or working relationship with the person, the state you are in an arms control agreement with is important. Unfortunately, if you look at the trend in the past 30 years, all of this has been eroded quite dramatically. The Russian Federation has dramatically eroded the arms control system that we have been able to develop in the post-Cold War era, to an extent that you can say now most instruments are either dead or on life support, or simply not credible. So that is a very, very stark reminder of how dangerous the world we live in is. And also the fact that, again, all roads lead back to Kiev, that what happens in Ukraine and the outcome of that conflict and the importance of Ukraine to prevail as a sovereign independent country, and conversely for the Russian aggression to fail, because I think that's a precondition to start rethinking through European security architecture. And as part of that, we'll think about arms control. But, and I close here, we'll have to recognize that it's no longer a two-party game. It will have to be, especially if we think in terms of nuclear arms control in the nuclear realm, it will have to include at least 3 parties, the third party being the PRC, which of course, as we know today, has zero interest in any talk around arms control, let alone any interest in transparency when it comes to its nuclear modernization. So these are the hard facts. So yes, it's important, but right now it's really a complex issue to move forward.
So I take from that, maybe in 2040, we'll get back to you. Jade, can I turn to you? And I just want you to also say a word on space, with a particular reference to the idea that space weapons, by their nature, can be fairly indiscriminate, particularly if the capability in question is indeed nuclear capable, and they would take out a large number of national assets, satellites from a number of countries. The reason I wanted to ask you this is because, do you think that Russia's risk tolerance has fundamentally changed today? Are they willing to take some sorts of steps, including those that would perhaps affect satellites of a country, an ally like China, that they wouldn't have in the past? Is it a regime that is it has a different risk calculus?
Well, I think that depends on the context. So, for example, if we look at September 2022, after you had the successful counteroffensives, then you did start to see some pretty worrying actions, like on the Russian side, because there was, at the moment, I mean, Putin's general smugness, he has a reason to be a bit smug, unfortunately, because the war is going, well, his way is a bit strong, but it's not the worst trajectory, and his betting on that he cares more about destroying Ukraine than the West cares about saving it doesn't seem like a terrible bet all of a sudden. Certainly a lot better than it did in 2022. So I think we need to talk about different parts of context, but I think we also as well need to not, all roads do lead back to Kyiv, but Ukraine also plays a very particular role in Russia's understanding of itself, in Russia's understanding of its role in the world, in Russia's kind of geopolitical understanding. So there are certain things that can apply to Ukraine that may not apply more generally to Russia's behavior. I mean, part of the issue with the new kind of space weapons is they also point us to, yes, they're a reminder of Russia's ability to still, technologically innovate, which is often kind of poo-pooed in the West in the West. But I think any soldiers in Ukraine will tell you they are able to adapt and innovate. But it does also still point us to certain weaknesses, such as Russia does not have the sort of satellites, let's say, that the US has access to, that Five Eyes have access to. And so part of this, I would say, to bring us back to the key word, is about a Russian form of deterrence too.
Okay, Henrik, can I turn to you and just get you to perhaps address Callum Fraser's question about, you raised the possibility when I goaded you into it, but about acting disproportionately. But the question was, if the last 2 years, an invasion of Ukraine and all of the other developments we've been talking about have not already enabled politicians and political leaders to take these, make these step changes, what actually will? Do you think there's any political appetite for the sorts of, the sort of thing we were touching on?
We are not that well prepared because the peace dividend has left us, I would say, thinking differently. As you brought up, Jade, we are basically still working with the sort of mental assumption that things will go well, and perhaps Ukraine is more of a nuisance, a parenthesis, and if we continue the support, the problem will go away. That is, of course, not true, but I think in the backbone and the minds of many, it is still there, because so much has actually, at the end of the day, gone pretty well over the last 30 years. Regarding space and arms control, I think these issues have been well covered. Well, proportionality is a key principle at war. I mean, this is a part of the whole setting in international humanitarian law, what you're allowed to do, what you are not allowed to do. I would, though, argue that in a situation that is not war, we need not to necessarily take this principle applicable within the sort of legal framework of war, because that gives us, as I said, a huge disadvantage. It makes us very predictable in a situation where we have an adversary that is not necessarily extremely risk-taking. I'm still of the opinion that Putin is risk-averse in a sense. There are a few occasions when their actions have been sort of completely reckless and put sort of Russian existential interests, i.e. national survival, regime stability, etc., at stake. So he is basically risk-averse, hence predictability from the adversary fits him perfectly well. That's the name of his game, reflexive response, anyone. That's what they would like to do. I mean, this fight long-term struggle is, of course, long-term about Western unity and cohesion of our institutions, the European Union and of NATO. And he bets short-term in Ukraine. I completely agree with Jade, but there are bigger things at stake here, and these stakes are linked through the institutional framework that we have created. trust and within our populations, and trust for our institutions and systems is actually more of the center of our gravity than anything else. To just say a few words regarding disproportionality and unpredictability, I do believe that there is space for doctrinal thinking here. And when I'm throwing out these ideas, I don't do it because I necessarily have a blueprint on how to do it. But I think we have come in a way to an end in that regard, that proportionality is working to our disadvantage in this very peculiar hybrid war that we are currently in. Regarding unity and trust, I mean, yes, one could argue that, the Western societies, they have not yet seen the light, and there is an obvious risk of a Ukraine fatigue. I would say at least in the circles where I and my country works, this was an issue more 6 months ago. Now, when Ukraine is in dire straits, I think the seriousness has definitely returned. My government has today presented a new package for military support to Ukraine for 2024, 2025, and 2026 of 75 billion Swedish crowns, i.e. 6.5 billion euros, which together with development assistance and support to other organizations means that we will support Ukraine with 100 billion Swedish crowns over the coming 3 years, 24, 25, 26. And several other countries are moving in this direction too, and we must do it. And I'm not at all sure that the word "as long as it takes" is actually bad to be rubbed in to our populations, because this is a struggle where we must, with steadfastness and conviction, stand firmly behind Ukraine as long as it takes, if with or without having defined the strategic end state or not.
Thank you, Henrik. And it strikes me that there's a difference between being disproportionate and being unpredictable, and one can do these in different ways. I think certainly Russia probably didn't expect that it would face the expulsion of 500 intelligence officers across Europe.
They didn't expect Swedish and Finnish NATO membership either.
And nor did you, by the way, but yes.
Well,
it
took us 10 weeks to...
Yes, but I think one of the problems is we've pulled so many policy levers, there aren't always that many left, and one has to search for new ones, unexpected ones, and that's not in our repertoire. But historically, we're here at King's, there's great historians here who know in the Cold War, and particularly late Cold War, there were many unpredictable policy levers, very aggressive ones, sometimes perhaps too aggressive, but certainly things like intelligence flights near Soviet borders, submarine operations were always very punchy throughout the Cold War. So, we can't be ahistorical about this, assuming we have no experience with all of this. Rory, I'd like to invite you to take up any of that you want, but I would also specifically just like you to touch on that question. Do you think there is any prospect whatsoever of any sort of serious arms control in the Indo-Pacific region in the next 10 years, or is this a totally off?
Look, I will pick up on arms control as a hook for a few, I think, key points I'd like to wrap up with. And look, sad to say, the short answer is no. Mm-hmm. But I would link arms control to the confidence of risk reduction measures and confidence building measures. Mm-hmm. And I think the realistic objective in the Indo-Pacific is competitive coexistence. It's the Chinese leadership or the PLA leadership every day saying not today. I mean, the Americans like to say that's their target in deterrence, and it absolutely is. We need a window of 10 more years of that happening across the Taiwan Strait and elsewhere. And that means that when the Chinese use risk as this instrument of coercive influence, when they send coercive forays of their air force into Taiwan's or into their navy into the South China Sea, or harass our ships when we're doing UN mandated work to intercept proliferation shipments to North Korea, that they learn that there are risks involved for China's interests in this behaviour, risks of escalation, and that these are unacceptable. The problem at the moment is that one of the Chinese instruments is to cut off dialogue every time many other countries start talking about conversations about risk reduction, confidence building measures. The United States and the Soviet Union in the 1970s and the 1980s had much better channels of communication and mechanisms of communication on risk reduction at sea in practice than the United States and China, and most of us and China have in the Indo-Pacific today. So I think that's the area of focus, rather than at this stage arms control or non-proliferation or disarmament. We've got to cherish what we have in that space, but we also have to be realistic about the fact that that's not the language that the PLA are interested in.
Rory, thank you. We've only got 2 minutes, so I'm not going to go back to the audience. I'm sorry, because I think we wouldn't have time. Instead, I'll just try and very briefly pick out a few key themes. I think it's been really interesting to reflect on that question of deterrence may not be breaking down, but it is getting more challenging to uphold. And that's one way to think about it. The alignment between these different countries is strengthening, and part of the answer to that is much greater consultation among allies, but also more creative thinking about the tools we would use across different theatres. Benedetta, you raised a subject we didn't maybe say enough about, which is economic deterrence, and particularly economic deterrence in Europe, and whether China believes our economic deterrence. Do they see it as credible? Do they think we would use it? Because, of course, as Neil said in the previous panel, deterrence is about capacity and about the will to use it. We talked about a number of emerging domains. You mentioned several of them, including digital networks and transport and energy, and we had a very useful question on space. And I think your point about risk, Rory, gets to the heart of it, because risk reduction is, you said, so important. Risk is also something adversaries are willing to manipulate, to use, to heighten in ways that we are profoundly uncomfortable with. And I think Henrik made a really interesting point about the prospect of us having to think about how we are more unpredictable, some perhaps even disproportionate, in ways that somewhat redress that imbalance in perceptions of risk. And it seems we're at a very nascent stage in thinking about that problem, but there's a lot more work to be done. I'll just put a plug in for the other panels, because they'll be picking up a lot of this thinking. There's a keynote address on resilience at 2 o'clock by Oliver Dowden, which I think will pick up on a lot of the points you made, Benedetta. We have a nuclear deterrence panel at 2:30, which will discuss the sort of nuclear dynamics that undergird all of this, which we really didn't get onto, which I think is good. We would have gone down that rabbit hole had we done so. And then there's of course, some excellent discussions on AUKUS this afternoon, which is a really interesting, a sort of a very novel way of addressing these dynamics. And finally, on conventional forces and the credibility of conventional deterrence underlying all of this. But with that, I just thank you all for a very rich discussion, and please join me in thanking our panelists.
Thank you. Well done.